question, I may have missed it. I mean, you used the comment that, I mean, the reason for, I mean, a lot of your European activity or the contracts that have the European companies is because of the regulatory environment. But I also understood, I mean, mutation breeding in Europe, I mean, that is, it's going forward without any regulation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I did not make that connection.
Sorry, it's, we're a choice for them. They're absolutely free to do that work in Europe. We're just particularly good at it, so they will pay us to do it.
Okay.
Michael, are you saying, and I think again I grasped this, that you're saying that you're going to use new gene editing technologies to figure out what would be good, and you're going to go back to the conventional way of finding those traits and putting plants together? And
In the very short term, yes. In the long term, once you sort through the issues of FTO and get the appropriate commercial use licenses, once you have some clarity in what the regulatory view of the novelty of that product might be, and once you have a handle on the consumer acceptance, then we would proceed with developing a product with gene editing.
And do you see a lot more investment going into the flowers and those kinds of things that people aren't eating than in the hort side?
No major, I wouldn't draw a major distinction. There would probably still be, I can't really speak to the scale of investment, but I think the same sensitivities would be there, that consumers don't want a GMO flower, for example. I think the same sensitivities are there.
I don't know if that's true, because blowfish has been very successful, and that's a hobby item. And I think there may be an appetite for flowers that have unique traits that would appeal to gardeners.
Yeah, or blue roses, for example. Yeah, no, not to say that there's not, great traits you could create, or there may be some demand for it, but I think broadly the sensitivities would still be there.
Yeah, but it's the thin edge of the wedge.
Yep.
Right? If you can get people to appreciate that you can do this, then you can build on that to expand your market opportunity.
So one of the things we've seen is that as the climate's changing, we're getting wetter summers, certainly in the prairies, and so we're having all kinds of blossom rot disease problems.
Yep.
If you marketed that saying, nobody likes to spend 2.5 months of all that hard work getting the tomatoes to be red and then losing them just as they're picking them, right? I mean, nothing more frustrating. Do you see that as an opportunity to market this to home gardeners, to say, you know what, if you want to actually enjoy the fruits of your labor, here's some seeds that can do that?
Oh, that's an interesting, so I didn't really speak to that direct-to-consumer home garden market. That can be a little bit of a different beast. There you see more of I don't know, it's almost the opposite. That's where you see people wanting to grow heirloom, organic. You have those desires. So I don't know if that group is maybe potentially even more averse to the application of biotechnology. They would certainly appreciate the trait. That's a great example. But those consumers and some of the companies that market to those consumers have been notably in opposition to the application of biotechnology.
So why don't we, because right now it's meant to be an open discussion, so if you want to just come and grab your seat, Michael,
Yep.
and to all the speakers, we have
Heiss.
I have a question on, I always understood that, I mean, in Canada, I mean, the TNT, I mean, it's regulated by product, not by process. Whereas in your presentation, I mean, you used the example of basically of generating a novel plant variety using gene editing technologies would be considered TNT. But if you have a plant variety that results in the same phenotype, but generated through mutagenesis, it would not be PNT, even though the products would be identical. So I'm just wondering whether you could clarify that.
So the CFIA has said that it is based on the product. However, they also said that every GM product will be regulated as a PNT. And so that gets to be my concern, is they could say that, yes, any genome edited product it'll be case by case, but they've already set the precedent saying that every GM variety will be a PNT. So I've not seen them live up to the statement that it's case by case. Ian, you may have something to add to that.
Yeah, and I think that this is part of the challenge that we have with our current system is the clarity as to what Stuart is talking about. So for that statement, for example, giving the impression that all GM varieties will trigger a PNT, which is in contravention to the logic behind the whole system. And what that falls to is there's a statement on the Health Canada website that says all GM varieties have been assessed, which gives the impression that all GM varieties will be assessed, where it's accurate that as of today they have been, but as of tomorrow, a GM variety may not be a PNT. So there's a lack of clarity as to what that statement actually means, but it certainly gives the impression, as to what Stuart is saying, that it projects outward that all GM varieties will be regulated, when that's not necessarily the case because of the philosophy of the system, which is it's the product you create, not the process that you use. But I would say up until this moment, there hasn't been that many different traits or that many different processes, so we haven't really had to come to terms with the philosophy of our system. And I think gene editing is bringing that discussion to the forefront, because the variety of crops, traits, and methodologies you can use to arrive at those is becoming much broader.
Thanks, Ian.
Stuart, I had a chance to skim that UN report as well. And it seems to me, I mean, I don't know where the disconnect is with the environmentalists and again, what these kinds of technologies can achieve in terms of their goals as well. But in that UN report, they really reference the potential for garage science to start manipulating microbes, yeast and algae, whatever else, bacteria. So how do you propose that a regulatory system addresses that kind of thing, keeps it under control? I mean, you mentioned the CRISPR babies in China. These are humans, not bacteria. How do you get a handle on that, if you will, such that there isn't the ability to use GB technology as a weapon, if you will, or something that would pervade the environment that would be just a disaster to contain?
I think that's their biggest fear, is that, you can buy kits for a few $100s to, like you say, do this in your garage or in your basement. And the report mentions that there are groups of people getting together, and it's a network thing that they're starting to do this. So I think from a regulatory perspective, it does become a huge concern. At least in the agriculture space, we know we have a long history of products coming from other parts of the world that have been commercialized here without going through any regulatory oversight. I mean, most of the crop varieties we produce were seeds brought over by our ancestors from all the various countries of Europe that they originated from. There was a great story in the Toronto Star, maybe 10 years ago, where there was a Japanese guy that lived in an apartment building, and there was an empty lot next door, so one of his relatives in Japan or China had sent over some rice, and he was growing this rice on this vacant lot. And so I knew some people at the CFIA and said, "Oh, this is a great story. So you guys approved this variety of rice for import?" And they said, "Yeah, we're not touching this." So even today, there's those types of things are happening, right? We've got, with migration flows, we know there's varieties of beans and stuff like that coming up out of Central and South America, and are grown up here by people when they move up here, so, and they're not going through the regulatory system. So I think where the confidence comes from is that, at least from the plant breeding side of this, that new varieties will come in, but if they've been grown in another jurisdiction for centuries or decades or centuries, there's no reason why they can't be safely produced here. And I think where the question comes, if you're doing sort of the genome editing side of things, there's just not enough certainty around the technology to provide that regulatory comfort. I don't think that precise breeding is going to create any more risks than the technologies we're doing now. And I'm quite confident that they can enter the system if somebody was going to, you know, change a corn variety and grow it in their garden.
I just wanted to respond to, you know, the idea of misusing the technology or having somebody, that's what they're worried about, somebody misusing the technology. You cannot put the genie back in the bottle, though. The technology is there, and somebody who's going to misuse it is going to misuse it, whether we regulate a good development of our crops or not, or whether we, you know, end up shoving things into regulatory boxes that can never, you know, be opened, and therefore we stymie our own development. Whether we do that or not, there's going to be dual-use technologies that somebody's going to misuse at some point anyway. So the UN has every right to be concerned about that, but that doesn't mean you should be stymieing your regulation, because, you know, the people who are doing the development under regulation are not going to be the ones abusing it.
We've had regulations around tobacco, drugs, alcohol for decades, and we all know people under eight. I mean, how many people in this room drank under the age of 18 or 19? And I won't ask you to put your hands up, but I mean, I did, right? So those rules were there when I was that age. So I don't think just the creation of regulations that just removes, you know, it provides a level of comfort, but it's not going to stop anything from happening, right? Yes.
You kind of alluded to, Stuart, like a circle of life with political involvement in the regulatory process, and I'm wondering, it seems to me that South America has a broader perspective, a more progressive perspective around the approval process. So what part have you seen public trust plays? Because of course, public trust is germane to influencing any political involvement in how they mess with science.
So the one thing that both of those countries have is they do have some socioeconomic considerations as part of their regulatory assessment process. And I don't know enough of the details about it. I've studied the Brazilian one a little bit and the Argentinian one a little bit, but they at least have to involve consumers in getting a bit of a perspective on the technology that does become part of that risk assessment process. So it's a move away from science-based regulation, which always makes me a bit nervous, but certainly the fact that they're able to commercialize, so Brazil's now able to commercialize varieties in 11 months. Now I have heard from people up here that some of the herbicide-tolerant canola varieties are getting down to 12 months, that they can get a decision in a year. But Brazil is pretty consistently doing it at less than a year. Now, if that's the trade-off, you know, I would at least be willing to have a discussion to say, okay, if this consumer trust issue is really going to be the barrier for innovation moving forward, should we look at revising our regulatory system, or at least have the discussion about doing that to offset those concerns? And I, you know, if we're going to take an innovative approach into how to revise our regulatory system, I think that has to be on the table this time.
Starting here.
I have a sort of a follow-up on the earlier question. I mean, you used the waxy corn as an example. If I understand it correctly, was no legal requirement to identify this as a PNT, because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same trait. However, a decision was made to notify the regulators, and I'm sort of wondering what was the thought behind that thought. I mean, of course, I could see, well, maybe the public would create a backlash, but at the same time, I think if companies are notifying the regulator, it almost creates the perception that, well, yes, it's the same trait, but we have something to hide that we need regulatory oversight on. So I'm sort of wondering about sort of the thought process. What would have happened, and maybe if Basic Patel would go ahead and say, hey, it's not a novel trait, doesn't require any regulation, we're going to commercialize this in Canada, we have nothing to hide, so let's go forward and do it. It would be a very bold, but any comments?
Well, I don't want to speak for Corteva, but I think from an industry point of view,
it's the ambiguity in our regulation that makes it difficult for people to be certain of whether they are or are not novel, so hence the question, but.
It's unambiguous,
And
it's not a novel trait.
And I would say the other element is being a responsible industry member and not wanting to create controversy. There was an effort to be a responsible steward of the technology and bring it forward. So I'll let Renee maybe speak on, as it's his product that I'm using as an example.
So globally, there was an approach to approach regulators and have an open discussion that it was a new technology, right? This was, if you go back a couple of years ago, that's a long time in terms of technology, and the idea of being openness and transparency with some of these first ones and getting a clear opinion. Also getting the government of Canada's opinion is helpful in other countries where there's a less functional regulatory system and Canadian approvals carry weight or help us move forward in other jurisdictions. So those are some of the thoughts that went into seeking clarity from the Canadian. And also at the time it was assumed that this would be a fairly straightforward process.
Yeah, I think a statement from the Canadian government through that kind of system we're talking about, which is a request for an opinion on novelty, where it would say, based on your information and based on our system, this does not require an extra layer of regulation beyond our standard food safety regulations because it is accepted as safe. Although that's not an approval, that's a powerful statement from a respected government. And it allows the regulator to make those decisions in a more rapid manner. So we're hoping that we can install something like that moving forward. So another question over here?
So on the same line, you talked about 8 to 18% protein increased yield is novel.
Mm-hmm.
You also made a statement that the waxy corn has been sitting there for 18 months without a statement.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have that as a great work point. But the reality is the subjectiveness of what's novel and what's not, and the unwillingness to make a statement is where the bottleneck is. It's not about the clarity of the rules, it's about whether anybody's willing to go ahead and work through the system as it's designed.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's where we're hoping that with a revised approach to the guidance, we can lock down the decision-making metrics so that other things cannot get in the way of making those statements. That the process is lined up strong enough that there's less opportunity for other considerations beyond science to slow things down. Because right now it's very open, so it's really open to interpretation, our system, and we need to narrow that in to a tighter space so that we can't be spending time hypothesizing about the outcomes of these products, that the decisions will have to be made, because otherwise you can point to the guidance document and say there's no reason to wait. Whereas right now we know from a philosophical point of view that waxy corn is not novel, but the guidance documents are not clear enough to point at a specific sentence and go, and this is exactly why you have to make the decision today. So we want to help them there.
There wasn't a carve-out for what's a definition of novelty, and how would you put a box around that statement?
We had that discussion in one of our working groups just last week, which is, so what is a trait? Is the trait the genetic code? Is it the phenotype in the field? And that's the kind of definition that we need to get specific on, so that innovators know what it is they're trying to determine is different or not. Because right now, depending on who you talk to, you could debate what that exact definition of a trait is.
So, but you go back to the beginning of your talk, and the answer is you regulate the product, so the definition is already in the guidelines that it's the product.
Depending on what you call a product. Is the product the phenotypic trait? Is it the protein? Is it the genetic sequence? And that's never been defined, which is what we need defined in a very clear space. They need to say it's the phenotype or it's the genetic sequence, and then you know what it is that you have to characterize. Because right now it's vague there.
So why is it vague?
Well, I think I would kind of give two reasons. It's not a lack of effort on behalf of the regulators in the initiation of the system to make a good system. I think the regulators really are trying to have the best system in the world. I think at the time, the traits they were seeing coming in were, well, this corn didn't have BT before, and it does now. So what the product was rather obvious. There wasn't a whole lot of room for debate. It wasn't a 12% increase in disease resistance. It was on-off traits in most spaces. It was herbicide tolerant, or it wasn't, and now it is. So they didn't really need that level of specificity because the traits in the pipeline were rather on or off. But that's what's changing with gene editing and modern breeding techniques. It's not on-off traits anymore. It's not single gene managed traits. It's disease resistance can be 17 different genes in a plant that impact disease resistance. So that's why the breeding we're getting into now is forcing that question where we didn't really have to ask the question before. So that it's kind of changing the landscape a little bit in that space. In my opinion. I'll end everything with in my opinion. How's that? Any other questions? John?
As a former regulator myself, I recognize the philosophical difference between Canada and the U.S. as both countries try to move forward with modernizing many of their regulatory systems. And in the U.S., there's this recognition that being more prescriptive can provide many benefits, whereas in Canada, they want to be outcome-based, trying to use greater flexibility in the opinion of some senior regulators to best accommodate the needs of the mom and pop shops and the big multinationals. Unfortunately, it's not only confusing for industry to not have a certain level of prescription, but it's very difficult for inspectors and evaluators. They get in there and there's nothing that lays out the specificities for them to do their job. And somehow we need to get that message forward to senior people that philosophy does not really work well in the real world.
And I think that's it's not the one or the other. It's not absolute prescription and it's not completely case by case. It's finding the right balance in between that gives you the room when new things come up, but also give you enough guidance to make your investment decisions. And that survey that Stuart did showed that a large number of plant breeders are avoiding breeding objectives that they really don't need to be avoiding because they can't figure it out. And that's where we need to advance the guides. And I will say, we're talking about regulation and often in a negative tone. The regulators are at the table and committed to this discussion more so than I think I've ever seen. So, kudos to them for coming forward. These are not easy things to try to unravel, and they're really making an effort. So I think it's positive in that space that we have a cooperative approach to making new proposals.
So the American system is slightly more defined, and the Center for Food Safety sued the USDA over not following that to the T with alfalfa and sugar beets. Is there I guess I wonder, is the more defined it becomes, then the environmental movement has the opportunity to go through and tick off and say, well, this variety didn't do that study, so could the potential for environmental lawsuits just slow it down even further?
I think that's finding that balance, but also in the Canadian system, it's not as easy to be litigious here as it is in the U.S. It's almost like in the U.S. for a number of years, the approval system became develop your product, gather your data, get the approval, go through the lawsuit, they lose, then you get your, that just became a part of the approval for a number of years. But I think our system doesn't lend itself to so easily just sue the government for the application of their regulation. So I'm not too worried about that, but if you got overly prescriptive to the point where every product needs A, even if that makes no sense, you don't want to get to that space. But right now we're really on the other end of it, where it's completely open-ended, and that's what we need to bring forward. And the regulators want it too. They want to understand what their job is specifically. And like in the US or even in the EU, it's understanding that there is a fundamental level of food safety regulation in play at all times. It's when do we need to add another layer of pre-market assessment? When do we need to check the homework of the companies to make sure they've lived up to their responsibilities? That's the critical question at the end of the day. So I think probably for time, that's me. Yeah. So maybe I'll just say, as I threw up the work plan there, and then in our tables in the afternoon, you'll get those 3 parts of the work plan with a few specific questions to kind of drive some dialogue, to see kind of, as with the conversation we had with the table at the back in terms of defining products, or what do you need as an innovator out of this work plan for it to work to you. So look forward to those discussions this afternoon.
Yes, Gijs.
I want to make a comment, maybe, I think sort of the challenge, I think we have a significant challenge. I mean, you put reference was made to Alison van Eemena, a very proponent of science and of technology. She's doing really well. I mean, she has about 6,000 Twitter followers. Semex is doing even better. You got about 8,900 Twitter followers. CropLife is outdoing you by about 200, so 9,100. Then you have Gwyneth Paltrow, who is having 2.9 million. That's where consumers are getting their information. So I think we have a huge challenge. And so I think that's probably where we need to focus. I mean, where do people get their information? Who are the influencers for what people think? And I think, so maybe my advice is, I mean, hire a celebrity to speak for the industry rather than putting scientists up at the podium.
Maybe that's the answer. We need better vehicles. Yeah, there was a story that came out why consumers are not listening to us, right? So I think we've tried. We've had a lot of people. I know, Stuart, you've got a lot of followers. You're out there. I see your posts. I fear like we are preaching to the choir. The people that are probably following us, following Semex, maybe following following CropLife, they are already believers, right? It's the people that that we really need to reach. They're not our followers. We're not reaching them. So, absolutely right. Yes.
More of just a statement for that there is a substantial amount of research that's gone into what resonates with the average Canadian or the average person. So, if anyone really hasn't ever delved into that before, if there's a commodity board or something you can reach out to, or a different ag organization, like there's a lot of information on the best way to really influence people. I think Stuart would know this quite well, based on some of the work that you do. But in my experience, of course, it's always been you have to have the face, and you can't have somebody from an organization. They got to be their own person. That's the main one. It's like it's a small scale thing, so it's a lot more effective as opposed to say Gwyneth Paltrow with 18 million followers and maybe a very, very small fraction actually pays attention to what she's saying. It's unfortunate that fraction happens to be huge, but that's the case. Anyway, if anyone's interested in that stuff, there's a lot of research. Talk to the ag groups. They know what's going on. A lot of it.
Yes, Ian.
On that point where you get unfortunate amplifiers at some points, like a Gwyneth Paltrow, and that idea of partnering with a celebrity. I'll segue to this something before Elba. It's what we talked about, partnering with celebrities. And when celebrities pump themselves up in their own brands, when they fall from grace, the only person hurt is them and their own brands. When your industry partners with a celebrity and the skeletons come out of the closet, it rarely ends well for said company. And I can think of companies like Subway and others who would look back at, you'll notice a lot less celebrity endorsements these days for companies because it just doesn't work out very well in the long run. But to that point of engaging a broader public and how to do it, as the gentleman said, one thing that we found is we've started a public outreach campaign through a website called Real Farm Lives. And it's how do you show people that it's real people on the farm. It's not that there's actually farm families involved and they're making decisions on their farm. And when you see a farm family with children making the decision to use these technologies, it goes, well, they wouldn't put their family at risk, so why would they put me at risk? When it's at a distance, it's a faceless enterprise. But the key thing that the group we're working with said is everybody cares about their food, but not enough to learn anything about it. So the first thing you have to do is entertain, because that's what people are looking for is entertainment. Then you got to educate through entertainment, and then you can activate the population afterwards, because they're too busy to go, I'm going to spend an hour learning about agriculture today. They have too many other things to do, and fair enough. So if you can offer them entertainment, they'll say, well, I do need to be entertained, so I'm willing to listen to what you have to say. It's got an entertainment value. So it's back up even farther in your message to get entertainment at first.
Yeah, and unfortunately, people from science background are not well prepared to be entertainers. Well, maybe some of us are, but not. Yes.
I hear you guys volunteering for a celebrity role in a Hollywood production. This is going to be wonderful, guys.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, what I forgot to say too about the Allison thing is that she mentions quite disdainfully that it's taken a quarter century or more to get the Bounty salmon to market, for example. And who's going to innovate in that space if nobody's willing to buy it? There's no clarity. So a question and a comment, and maybe that you'd answer this. You guys are going after whole cows and hornless cows. say, has limited value, but some value to farmers and certainly to the animal. But try to explain to a consumer why, first off, most of them didn't know that cows had horns anyway. They don't know why you need to get rid of them if they do. And so, but they all have dogs with clipped tails. So why don't you start with a dog with a clipped tail naturally, and then let them buy it and think this is a wonderful thing. I didn't have to mutilate my dog at birth, and then move into the ag sector. I mean, does that ever cross your mind as a way to get into the mainstream of what consumers know every day before you start tackling a real world problem? Or
Well, I can tell you, we've taken multiple approaches, fortunately in different countries, on how you get the consumers to understand that there are welfare concerns in the food production system.
Yeah.
So if you do that, you open the door that consumers didn't know there was a welfare concern in our animal production system, and the conversation might go where you don't want it to go. Like, we actually got scolded very hard by Secretary Perdue one day to quit showing some pictures of animals being horned. But making a link to something that people can understand is important. We've had more success with the run to the litter mentality around genetics, that everybody who's had a cat or a dog has seen the run to the litter, and if you have 9 puppies, 1 or 2 might not make it. You take that to something like chickens, where you have 1 million chickens hatched every day, that's 100,000 runs to the litter kind of mentality. So I think you're right. I think bringing it to something that people can put their finger on is important. But it turns out that polling, a lot of people do understand polling. They do understand that if you show a video, you don't show the newborn, you show a video of a cow with horns walking to the feed trough. She gets a lot of space at the feed trough, and some other animals aren't happy. You can show workers and stuff too. So, the feedback we've got from the public perception is that the welfare trait polling resonates. It resonates with the producers as well. And castration of swine resonates with consumers. And then you can show your dog being neutered and why you do that and why that's important. Most people don't like to see their dog with the cone of shame on for a couple of days walking around the house with stress. So that one works well.
There was a question. Sorry. Did you have a question?
I wanted to add to the conversation that for a long time, we've had agriculture in the classroom in Canada. I'm the immediate past chair. And it remains difficult to get our message out that, hello, there's millions of kids in classrooms every day. We go in with this kind of messaging and neutralize or attempt to neutralize the bias at a young age. I think more support for agriculture in the classroom in Canada would be appreciated from not only everyone in this room, but for all the members of CFA, OFA, and the regulators across the country. I don't understand why that isn't getting more more attention, even though we jump up and down all the time saying, what about the kids?
Yeah.
So we have a great website, and you can go to it. The provinces are all listed, and we have fabulous resources that talk to kids in classroom. They're a captive audience, right? And they're consumers.
One thing we could do is we could provide science fair projects. I was at my daughter's science fair project. There's some really interesting discussions. Some of them were about biotechnology. If we could provide ideas for kids to work on these kind of projects, it reaches their parents too, right?
It does.
Yeah.
That's how the pollution thing works. It's how the recycling thing, the smoking, like a lot of these things germinate in classrooms and then spread to the larger population. I think we should use it.
And let's be real, you know what? A vast amount of the population lives in cities and have no connection at all to their food supply. No connection at all. I'm sorry, a field trip in kindergarten to a petting zoo is not exposure to agriculture, and it's really, really important that penetrates, maybe through children, but into the adult population. Where is your food coming from? Would you rather know that it's coming from a local producer? What does it mean to get something from Alberta into Quebec? Would you prefer that to something coming in from Brazil? And it's very important because, yes, videos are out there on the internet, and people are concerned about mass farming in bad conditions, maybe in parts of the United States, but the alternative isn't there. The messaging isn't there.
One of the best examples I've seen of that is the Fair Oaks Dairy outside of Chicago. 30,000 cows. They could have been a big target for animal activists, animal rights, but what they did was they designed tours. They bought buses. They designed an entertainment. I think someone mentioned entertainment. They provide a place for kids to play with animals. They show how calves are born. Now, of course, they have a product, Fairlife dairy products. They've just done a fantastic job, and I guess in Canada we don't have something equivalent of that, but we need to think about how we can bring consumers to the farm and connect them with their food.
Well, I think that Farm Day in Quebec has been really good.
Oh, yeah.
Montreal, to get families out, and it's really taken off.
Yeah. Maybe we should have a, visit the farm day. We should promote that. One. Yep. So,
Breakfast on the farm.
right. Yep.